You might have heard of the firefighters that died because they couldn't drop their old tools. For context, these were forest fires, and the tools were chainsaws and backpacks. These things were what they needed to fight the fire, but at this point they were already losing the battle and needed to cut and run. A different example of the same phenomenon was a tightrope walker. This high wire performer fell 120 feet and died, and after they started falling, reached for the balance pole in the air instead of the wire beneath them. That doesn't make any rational sense, but the balance pole is the tool that you're used to holding, and so you're not willing to let go of the tool that you're used to holding, even if it doesn't make sense and you might lose your life. In all likelihood, you and I are not tightrope walkers, but this same phenomenon of people being unwilling to abandon what they're used to could be life or death for us. I just finished Dr. Kate Mann's book, Unshrinking, where she explains that there is a case when doctors are relying on an old tool so much that it is actually taking the lives of their patients. Doctors' tools change all the time. Every year, new treatments are developed, and those new treatments lead to different ways to save people's lives. Sometimes the development of those treatments is flagrantly unethical. In the examples of the artificial heart, when the artificial heart was developed, it was tested on Black patients who did not have informed consent. I'm flashing this book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta, because as you might be aware, many of the tools that doctors use now to keep people like you and me alive depended on research that was done on human cells that were taken without consent. This is not the point of the video, it's just a part of medical history that is necessary for this example. We'll look instead at the example of the artificial heart. The artificial heart didn't used to exist. It is a new tool among many CT scans, MRIs, DNA tests. There's all these different tools that doctors didn't have. I'm belaboring the point too much. Let's get back to the firefighters. When you're fighting fires in the forest, a chainsaw can be a life-saving tool. When a patient needs a heart transplant, an artificial heart can be a life-saving tool. But if you need lung surgery, it's useless and harmful and dangerous. Just like if you need to run from a fire, your old tool is harmful and dangerous. What is the point? The point is that doctors are using the tool of telling people to lose weight so much that it is taking lives. I've now posted 2 videos deep diving into Kate Mann's book, Unshrinking. And in those videos, I've covered how medical fat phobia, doctors just assuming that the problem is weight and moving on with their lives, is a life or death issue. Of course, there's going to be individual cases where losing weight is going to be the right tool for a doctor to use. But what percentage of the time is that the appropriate tool? And comparing that number to what percentage of the time doctors actually use that tool. Something like 15,000 people watched the videos covering this book, and an unexpected consequence of that is that the comment section was full of people testifying to the fact that they went into the doctor with a real and known issue, and the doctor turned them away, just telling them to work on their weight. Another person told me a story about her parents, one of whom had cancer and was not treated because the doctors continued to pick up the tool of telling them to lose weight. And tragically, the cancer wasn't even discovered until the autopsy after the person had died. To that commenter, thank you for sharing your story. My heart is with you in more ways than our public on this channel. Most of the time, there are not simple solutions to complex problems, but in this case, just being aware of it might be enough to save a life. A while back, I had the privilege of interviewing Dr. Jill Delston on her book, Medical Sexism, on the many ways that doctors fail patients in this domain. Dr. Jill Delston cites study after study after study of all the different ways that doctors' internalized bias leads to fatal consequences for women. As ridiculous as it is to say, it is true that in some cases, simply having a man with you in the doctor's office might be enough for the doctor to take you seriously, depending on what the issue is. As I've been studying examples of the history of racism in medicine, I came across stories of black women married to white men who, when they started bringing their white husbands to the doctor's office with them, started having a completely different experience of the medical system. And it wasn't until I read this book, Unshrinking by Kate Manne, that I realized that it isn't just women and it isn't just black people. It is fat people as well that have the same negative and deadly negative experience of the medical system. And that, as ridiculous as it is, if it is truly a life and death medical condition, bringing a thin person with you to the doctor might be one of the only ways to have that doctor take you seriously. Not everyone has a white friend they can take to the doctor, and not everyone has a male friend they can take to the doctor, and not everyone has a thin friend that they can take to the doctor. And the very premise that people need to be doing this to keep themselves alive in this healthcare system is morally outrageous. But rather than end on me just being upset, I want to actually cycle back to Jill Delston, who, when I interviewed her, I asked about this.
My short answer to your question is I don't make recommendations to patients. Mm-hmm. And instead, my goal is to talk to doctors. They're the source of the problem. They're the ones who need to change. They're the ones who have the power to adjust.
This, by the way, is Jamila Jones, one of my content creator friends. We're interviewing Jill on the podcast, Too Much Nuance. The episode is linked. It's just on YouTube right now. I'll be putting it up elsewhere as soon as I can.
That's who I think of my audience as being. Now, the reality is often the audience is the patients. And you could be the most informed person in the world, and you could be the most confident and loud and unapologetic patient in the world, and still not be able to make any headway in the doctor's office because they have power and you don't. So I think that that's a real challenge. And if I sat here and I gave recommendations, then I would worry somebody would say, oh, I failed. I didn't do it right. I didn't get the prescription that I needed. And if only I had done XYZ, maybe I would have. No, it's not always the case. Sometimes it's just straight up injustice.
So at the risk of getting a little emotional again, it wasn't the fault of the parent for dying of cancer because they didn't advocate enough for themselves in the doctor's office. It was the doctor's fault, full stop. If you have a thin friend at your disposal to take with you to the doctor's office, go for it. I encourage anyone to use any tool at their disposal to advocate for themselves in this deeply flawed healthcare system. So with the caveat that I don't want you to conflate my pragmatism with victim blaming, a couple concluding thoughts. It can be comforting to us to think that the era of stolen cells and unethical experimentation is a relic of the past. But those harms persist in the form of high maternal mortality rates, lower fetal birth rate. I didn't even talk about this. There are fetal birth weight gaps there's evidence on evidence on evidence. The harms persist in the black community. The harms persist for women in the way that we treat them. And the harms continue to persist in how we treat larger bodies as well. When the firefighters refused to put down their own tools, they lost their own lives. If the institutions of medicine will not drop these tools, they will continue to sacrifice the lives of others. The only guaranteed way to do no harm is to first perceive the harm.